Peeps, Kenny Molotov here at home, and I wanted to talk to you guys briefly about how I study for tests so that you have a game plan when you go into either an apprenticeship program or any sort of course that you might have to take so that you can get the best results for yourself as possible. The first thing that I want to show you is the marks I was able to pull in the past so that you can get a vibe as to how well these two methods worked for me. In my intermediate plumbing, 38 out of 38, 61 out of 66, 40 out of 40, 65 out of 75. But I wanted to talk to you guys briefly about what I do so that you can figure out whether it's for you or if it's not for you, or maybe one of the methods is better for your style of learning. Basic way that I normally study for these tests, I would go through the notes that we got every single day, and what I would do is I would literally sit down and write the same note over and over and over again until I could write it out by heart. Normally what I would do is I'd sit down and I'd write the minimum distance between a 2-inch fixture P-trap and its protecting vent is 4 inches. I would take that, I'd write it once on this side, I'd flip the page like so, then I'd write it again, and then from here I would come back down and I'd write it a third time, then I'd flip it and I'd write it again. And the reason why I'm doing that is because if I write it one way and then write a second way and I flip it over, then I'm actually going against it. I'm not able to read it from left to right. That way I'm not cheating by looking up or looking down, in other words. I would literally do that over and over and over again until I can sit down and write that note out by heart. And then once I could write it out by heart, I'd then go on to the second line inside of our notes, which would be the minimum distance between a water closet flange and its protecting vent does not apply. And I'd write that over and over and over again until I memorized that. Then I'd write the first one that I first memorized and then the second one that I had memorized and see if I can write them out in order without looking back at the sheet that I initially read them off of. And I just keep doing this over and over and over again. What I noticed was if you do this, what will eventually occur is you will actually be able to write an entire page out of notes without looking at the notes that you initially wrote out. That's how many times I would write them. And I found this to be the most useful way of memorizing for me. And the reason why I say that is because I was able to retain as much information as possible, and I feel like you're sort of tapping into your long-term memory rather than your short-term memory when you're doing it this way. In other words, when we came to the final week of school, week 8, and I'd start studying again, I'd find that it was easier to write these things out because I already had written them in the past, if you know what I'm saying. That was the method that I always used when I was going into the tests on a week-by-week basis. However, I would change my style when it came to the final exam, and I'm going to tell you why. I found that with a certain amount of information, writing things over and over again was the right way to go because there wasn't too much knowledge that I had to get into my mind. But when we started working with 8 weeks worth of notes, it was way too hard and way too time intensive to sit down and write these things out over and over again. I needed a faster method of sort of going through the notes in order to check if I was up to par with what I needed to know. And because of that, I would start resorting to cue cards. Cue cards are an amazing thing because you can test yourself and figure out whether you know a ton of knowledge. These are all cue cards I'm currently using for the national exam. So what I would do is on the one side of the cue cards, I'd write the question. I'd say, what is the max allowed spacing between manholes on a 30-inch storm sewer? And on the other side, I'd have the answer, which would be 150 meters. What I would do is I'd read it, I'd answer it. If I answered correctly, I'd put it into one pile. If I answered incorrectly, I'd put it into a different pile. So all the correct answers I would push to the side once I was done testing myself, and then I'd specifically test myself on all the things I didn't know the answer to. And it's a lot of fun actually to do testing this way because it's sort of like a game. You're trying to figure out whether you know it and you're not going through the mundane action of writing it a million times. But here's the thing you gotta know. The reason why I like this is because it's fast, but the hardest part about doing cue cards is writing the questions down initially. It takes a lot of time to go through all the notes and write all the notes out onto cue cards essentially. Here's what my wife and I used to do in order to make this a little bit faster. First of all, I'd implement my wife. She'd always ask if I needed help, and I said, you know what, it would be great if you could help me take all the tests that we have done, and every single question we're going to translate it down onto the cue cards. She would do a test and I would do a test, and we'd eventually have the entire course down on cue cards. And that's a quick way to get through these sorts of things. That would be be the hardest part, just translating it all into the cue cards. Keep that in mind. So once I finally have them on cue cards and I go through, put it into the 2 piles, what I will do is I will now, if I find that there are certain ones that I keep getting wrong, I will compile them into 1 pile, and that's when I'll resort back to the first method I was telling you guys about. I would sit down with all those cue cards that I failed at 2 or 3 times, and I would start writing them over and over and over again. That way I'm implementing both methods to get it lodged into my head. If you are going through an apprenticeship program and it's similar to the one that I went to, what you'll notice is that every single week you're going to have a test at the end of the week on all the knowledge they gave you that week. What I would suggest, the best method that I think about tackling this sort of course is writing all the notes out every week until you have them memorized. Take that test at the end of the week, and once you're done that test, then that following week, if you have time, then you start doing your cue card for the test that you just wrote. That way, if you do it 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, all the way to week 8, you come to your final exam, and instead of spending so many hours writing these out, you already have an entire stack of these things, and all you have to do your final week is just go through them until you have them all memorized. Keep in mind that when you're getting to week 8, sometimes teachers feel like they didn't ask enough questions about a certain topic, so what they'll do is they'll go back into the notes and find things that they should have tested you on, and then they'll put it on the final exam. So in other words, what you got to be worried about is if these tests represent the knowledge that you need for the final exam. I guarantee a lot of what you have on these tests will, but you have to try to weasel it out of your teacher if there's going to be anything on it that you guys didn't cover as much in the tests previous. Peeps, this method has really proven useful for me in the past. Writing it out as many times as you can and having to test yourself on a large amount of knowledge, then going to the cue cards, and that way on your final exam you'll be able to get through as much questions as possible without writing it out over and over and over again. These 2 methods I used for all 3, basic, intermediate, and advanced, and I was able to score in the top percentages in the class because of that. And there are 2 methods that I swear by, so if I ever have a test in the future, you know exactly how I'm going to be studying for these things. And currently I want to let you guys know I am studying for my national exam. These are the ways that I'm currently doing it as well. So peeps, I hope this helped. Let me know in the comments below if there are any other ways that you guys study that I might not have covered here, because the more methods that we have, the better it is for the entire community to know. Like, subscribe, comment below, and I'll see you guys very soon. Kenny Molotov, guys. Peace, baby.